Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Spitfire on My Tail Part 20. November the 9th, 1939. Tonight, this attempted assassination of the Führer will play its part and lead to new action. I was duty officer when the wing's duty officer telephoned and just told me, assassination attempt on the Führer. My breath almost stopped. I was happy that it turned out okay. To me, it is clear that England is behind this. Such read my letter to my mother. As I have mentioned before, we had nothing against England and really didn't see our fight with Poland as being much to do with the British. I probably saddled with them the blame for the assassination attempt because when I was at school, Studienrat Wörbelmann had convinced us that the British Secret Service was the largest and best in the world. Similar to the way, in later years, the Western countries blamed the KGB for everything before the Arabs came on the scene. On November the 21st, Hauptmann von Pfeil had his 32nd birthday. At our improvised casino, we, his officers, gave him a set of small silver cups. Out of these, we all had a few schnapps, even von Pfeil, who rarely drank. At the end of his party, he decided to fly a surveillance patrol with his Stabsrotte, which was a staff flight. Lieutenant Geller was now his adjutant, replacing Lieutenant Fermer, who had been promoted to squadron leader, and would fly as Rottenhund, which is the wingman of the classic Rotte. It didn't take long at all for them to get airborne because the aircraft were always kept at a high state of readiness. They had not been away long when we monitored some excited shouting on the radio from them, but we couldn't make out what was happening. Then the telephone rang and we heard the stunning news that they had both been shot down. Later, also by telephone, we learned that they had been surprised by some French Morane fighters and brought down. Lieutenant Geller had made a belly landing near Edenkoben, about 10 kilometers south of the field, and his aircraft was repairable. But von Pfeil had bailed out and was badly burned. He was taken to hospital in Heidelberg and was reported to be in a very serious condition. So there it was. The war had really come to us now, and the real impact and its consequences were well and truly driven home. Somewhere, some French pilots would be celebrating their victories with champagne, their ground crews congratulating them, eager to paint small crosses on the aircraft of the victors, much as we had done when we had broken the ice. But for us, Geller was badly shocked and von Pfeil was horribly burned. We had lost 2 aircraft and some of our naivety. So, this is what the real war is like, we thought. We had no idea how bad it would become. The next day was to bring no better news for us. During the Polish campaign, no problems with altitude and oxygen starvation had been experienced, but already in late 1939 the first reports of problems were coming in. Confidential notes indicated that some bomber and reconnaissance crews had suffered collapse whilst high-flying. For the most part, this wasn't fatal because there were always other crew members to replace mouthpieces or turn oxygen cylinders on. The affected airmen then usually recovered quickly, with no lasting injuries. However, in the single-seater fighter you are alone and any such error was almost certain death. This was almost certainly the case with Unteroffizier Hellwig. Whilst on patrol over French territory, he inexplicably dived straight into the ground from a height of 9,000 meters. He was killed instantly and the cause was recorded as oxygen failure. Our record wasn't looking too good. 2 aircraft lost and 1 damaged, 1 pilot dead and 1 seriously injured. I was nearly added to that list myself on November the 25th. The squadron, led by Helmut Kühle, was on an escort flight with some reconnaissance Heikel 111s. We had taken off from Lachen-Speyerdorf, which is south of Neustadt an der Weinstraße and north of Karlsruhe, quite close to the French border. Only 30 kilometers away was the massive Maginot Line, which was particularly heavily fortified here. As we were returning, I saw a high-flying French Breguet aircraft, probably also on reconnaissance, but in the opposite direction. I called up to tell Kühle, but for some reason he didn't seem to receive the message. Radio communications were still not too good and we had no contact at all with the aircraft which we escorted. The radio sets were tuned to the operating frequency whilst the aircraft was on the ground, and after that there was no altering it until we landed. So, if the tuning was slightly off, your communications were poor for the whole of the flight. Even if the set had been calibrated perfectly, the range was only about 40 kilometers. For whatever reason, Kühle could not understand my transmissions, so I decided to go at it alone. To break away and attack on my own initiative. My Rottenhund came with me, but as I pulled into a steeper and steeper climb, he stalled his aircraft and was forced to drop away, leaving me alone. The Frenchman must have been somewhere about 10,000 meters, almost at the operational ceiling of my aircraft. Nevertheless, I climbed at full power to attempt an interception, turning on the oxygen and putting the mouthpiece in at about 4,500 meters. I climbed to within range of him and was about to open fire when I stalled and fell away. I soon regained control of the 109 and began to climb once more, juggling with the propeller pitch control to get the best from the turbocharger. Again, when I thought I was about to bag my first victory, evening the score a bit for the last few days, I stalled and fell away. I'd been so close that I had clearly seen the French pilot. He would have had no chance had I had time to fire. For a third time I began the climb towards the interception. This time there would be no mistake. At a shallow climb I came within range of the target, only to find that my guns had frozen in the extreme cold of the high altitude. I was infuriated and began to actually curse my bad luck and the good fortune of the French pilot. I must have articulated this with some vehemence and dislodged the oxygen mouthpiece, and I passed out. My next memory was waking up in the plane with it flying in a slow curve and still losing altitude. I looked at the altimeter and was astonished to see that I was down to just 3,000 meters and still going down. I quickly leveled out and corrected the circular course. Then I had to get some idea where I was. I didn't recognize the area and the compass was still running wild. So I used the old ways and looked for the sun. It was morning and I knew where it should be to set a course to find the Rhine. Soon I found my landmark and began to fly parallel to the great river. I was looking for a large wooded area where I knew I had to make my turn to head for home. I saw it and followed what I thought was my home route, soon seeing an airfield. I duly put the undercarriage down and selected the flaps, slowing down for my approach. Before touching down, I took a last look around to make sure that there was no other traffic and suddenly realized that one of the hangars seemed to be in the wrong place. Then other buildings didn't look so familiar. My heart seemed to jump into my throat as I realized that I was trying to land at the wrong airfield. With reactions faster than I thought possible, I pushed hard on the throttle, retracted the undercarriage and wound the flaps in. I set course east back to the Rhine, but at an altitude of only 500 meters. On the way, I saw two low-flying monoplanes who made steep turns when they saw me. I judged them to be artillery spotter planes because I could see a member of the crew sitting in an open cockpit right at the nose of the aircraft. When I arrived back at the Rhine, I saw clearly that the bridges had been blown up. I was horrified as I realized that I had tried to land at the French airfield at Haguenau. I had earlier mistaken the forest of Haguenau for the Ordenswald, which are both north of Strasbourg and to the left of the Rhine. The two aircraft that I had seen had been really lucky. In those days the French didn't have many fighters, especially at that low altitude. If I'd been more alert, they wouldn't have stood much of a chance of surviving an attack. In any event, I was very low on fuel and so I had to conserve what I had to get back to base. Again, I followed the silver surface of the Rhine until this time I saw the correct forest and made my turn for home. Just to make sure, I overflew the field and took a good look around. I made the approach circuit and landed feeling a little tired and a bit shaky. When I had taxied the aircraft into its proper place, I switched off and pulled my flying helmet off. My hair was matted with sweat. I had been very lucky. The ground crew came over as I stepped out of the cockpit and one of them spotted a bullet hole in the wing. I tried to shrug it off with a flippant remark, but inside I knew I had had two very close escapes that day. Far from being impressed with my initiative, Helmut Kühle was not at all amused by my report and bawled me out for leaving the squadron. He wasn't about to listen to any excuse about unheard radio messages, and so I just took it. This would not be the first time that Kühle and I would not see eye to eye over the question of fighter tactics. During the fighting in Spain with the Condor Legion, he had developed the code of action. He thought a fighter pilot should not attack unless he was certain of success. In that way, he felt, pilots would grow more experienced without any needless loss. Apart from mentioning part of the story to my parents in a letter, I decided to say nothing about the incident to anyone else. I thought that I had acted properly and bravely. Indeed, if I had succeeded in downing the Frenchman, the result would have been considerably different. I didn't take it to heart for too long though. One thing I had learned in my early life was that sometimes you have just to take it to grin and bear. December 19th, 1939. At this time, the squadron was visited by Hitler himself. He had decided that he should spend his Christmas with his troops at the front. He had arrived in his special train at Neustadt and Landau and went to visit the infantry who were stationed north of Weissenburg. Then he came on to us. He stayed with us for about 2 hours, taking lunch from our field kitchen, and I had the interesting experience of sitting across the table from this formidable character and listening to his speech. Here I heard something which I didn't care for at all, and on reflection probably gave a clear indication of how this man thought and what he might do in the future. He said, with reference to the alliance with Russia, "If it would ensure victory, I would even become an ally to Satan himself." My admiration for Hitler and what he had done for Germany took a dent then, and it would not be the last time that those words would echo in my mind. January the 22nd, 1940. I both wrote to my parents and also sent them a telegram. I now urgently needed my skiing equipment. Imagine my surprise and joy when, having only just returned from leave, I found that the squadron was to be sent on a skiing trip to Kleines Walsertal, which was identical to Riezlern. Leave for the squadron was well overdue, mainly because of the aforementioned visit from the Führer over the Christmas period. Because of this, individual leave had been restricted, and to get everyone away in the shortest time, we were offered this state holiday. The scheme had a couple of distinct advantages. Firstly, we were all kept together and were only 300 kilometers from the front if an emergency should occur, and secondly, we would all get some altitude familiarization. The latter of these two was not, according to Dr. Lenz, our medical officer, strictly true. He felt that 10 days at 1,100 to 1,400 meters would do little or nothing for our bodies. He thought that 3 weeks at a height of 2,000 meters or more might do some good. At Lachen-Speyerdorf we began to prepare. The army unit, which was stationed near our airfield, issued us with skis and training began. I had organized some motorized skijöring, towing up to 6 people behind Kühle's staff car. Flat airfields are ideal for that kind of sport. However, this was no real preparation for individual cross-country and downhill work. In the meantime, the war went on. I was pleased with the way that the 109 performed in the very cold conditions. It was proving to be a very reliable aircraft. Between what action there was, we would take turns in gunnery and then a little time skijöring on the new snow. The winter of 1939-1940 was to be one of the coldest on record. January the 27th, 1940. I got another chance to score my first victory. We were to pick one of our returning reconnaissance plane at about 7,000 meters to escort it in. It hadn't arrived when, at about 1,000 meters above us, we saw an enemy reconnaissance plane which was escorted by 14 fighters. I thought that we would attack and went ahead with my Rottenhund. Kühle still waited for our aircraft to arrive. The enemy fighters didn't see me at all, probably still concentrating on our remaining 6 aircraft. I followed the reconnaissance aircraft, which was climbing steeply, and I lost my Rottenhund again. At about 9,800 meters I was some 10 meters higher than him, but I wanted to attack out of the sun. He veered over to port, and as I tried to follow, I slid away, also to port, and lost about 200 meters of altitude. Once more I was climbing, and I started shooting at about 500 meters, but after 220 rounds I stopped firing because the guns had jammed again, probably because of the extreme cold. The outside temperatures were about minus 57 degrees centigrade. He flew on, but it must have given him quite a shock to have been attacked by a German fighter so far inside France, near the city of Epinal. I got back unmolested, however, with the positive thought that I must carefully trim and tune my machine in every respect, motor and everything, so I can get more altitude. Again, the result of my initiative was a telling off from Kühle. He was a real stickler for the rules, and even though our reconnaissance aircraft was late and there was a tempting target, he wouldn't attack. I suppose neither of us was totally right. It was part of his job to maintain discipline and follow orders as far as possible, and youngsters like me were hungry for action. I had ended up as my Rottenhund on my own over hostile territory with enemy fighters about. I suppose it was impetuous, but I was keen to prove myself in combat. Soon after this it was time for our skiing. We were accommodated in the Darmstädter Hütte, where one small wing had been given over to our use. In our party there were 4 officers, Dr. Lenz, and 8 NCOs, but there were a further 50 guests at the Hütte. It was typical rural accommodation, providing us with meals and rooms, but any drinks had to be paid from our own pockets. At this time, Riezlern would take about 300 skiers and Mittelberg another 200. There were no ski lifts or services like that. All that was offered was the snow and some advice as to the best routes. I was the only one with any skiing experience and was therefore appointed by Kühle as instructor. His orders were strict: no injuries. And it was clear that I would be held responsible for any accidents, an unenviable position. I didn't mind being the instructor, although it did restrict me somewhat, not being able to take off on any long or difficult trips on my own. During the day we were skiing from about 9:30 to 12 and then after lunch from 13:30 to 16:30. After supper we would generally walk from the guest house to Riezlern about 2 kilometers to have our first drinks of the evening in the Post Hotel. As we became regulars, we were allocated a table in a function room where we were free from the curious gaze of the other guests and visitors. We had, for the time being, dispensed with the formality of military rank and instead addressed each other by our Christian names. However, some formality was retained, with the NCOs addressing the officers as Mr. Kühle, Mr. Steinhilper, Mr. Waller and Mr. Spenner. For entertainment, we invented a game of numbers which got faster and more boisterous as the evening wore on. It was a simple task. We would circulate the table, each person calling out the next number in the normal series, but any number which contained 3 or could be divided by 3 had to be missed by the player shouting "Hop!". Each time one of us made a mistake, we were awarded a match, and at the end of the competition we all had to reckon up our penalties at the rate of about 20 pfennigs per match. When 3 went too well, we added 7, and so on. It was a happy game and soon drew an audience drawn by the noise of our revelry. Some of the onlookers were, of course, girls, and some of them joined in with the game. At about 10 o'clock we would move out to the Sternbar, where there was music and dancing, but the drinks were much more expensive. One of the girls who came to watch the game was the young wife of a lawyer from Stuttgart. She was very intelligent and bright, and we enjoyed her company. She seemed to take a special liking to Hinnerkwaller. One evening during the game she joined in and sat with myself and Hinnerkwaller, with Helmut Kühle seated on the opposite side of the large round table. On this special occasion, Waller and Kühle had a private bet to see who could drink most Obstler and still be sharpest at the game. The penalty for a mistake in this case was to drink a glass of the schnapps. Somehow, Kühle was cheating, and so Hedda Seifert decided to intervene on Hinnerk's side. She had hidden a bottle of mineral water in a handbag and had a schnapps glass ready at hand. Beside her, she kept a long glass for the purpose of keeping the real schnapps. Each time Hinnerk lost and collected a penalty, she cleverly swapped the schnapps for mineral water and poured the schnapps into the long glass, refilling the now empty glass with water, ready for the next round. After about 20 glasses, Kühle wasn't showing any effects of drink at all. He was as sober as when he started. At the next penalty, Hedda got up, walked around the table and, picking up Kühle's glass, said "Cheers" as she downed the schnapps. She then resumed her place with us, confiding that Kühle was also drinking mineral water. He wasn't a squadron leader for nothing. The redoubtable Frau Seifert was not to be outsmarted by Helmut Kühle, and later, in the Sternbar, she invited him to the bar for a drink. This, of course, he couldn't refuse, and 2 long drinks were ordered. During the conversation, Hedda pulled her swapping trick again. With the consummate skill of a conjurer, she managed to take the long glass filled to brimming with neat schnapps and exchange it for Kühle's long drink. Then she gave the toast X, which means that the drinks go down in one hit. Kühle dutifully emptied his long glass and won, and we had to carry him home. Poetic justice for his cheating at the game. At the end of our leave, when everybody had some skill at skiing, I thought that we should have one last long trip to finish off in style. I planned for us to go up to the Hahneköpfle, which meant a climb to about 1,900 meters. We had already done the Ifenhütte before. This had taken us up to 1,400 meters, and I judged that we could make it down the whole run. Kühle cautioned me to be careful, and I promised to keep the downward skiing under strict control. He didn't need to remind me of my responsibility for the health and safety of the personnel. First, we had to ski cross-country for an hour to Auenhütte, which was at an elevation of 1,200 meters. Then it was off with the skis for the climb up to Ifenhütte, about 1.5 hours hard work. There we had lunch and then pushed on to the top, wading through deep snow and zigzagging upwards for about 2 hours. The effort was worth it when we finally stood gasping for breath at the Hahneköpfle. The air was crisp, cold and clear, and the sun shone down upon us, burning our faces brown. We rested for a while and enjoyed the view before our descent. I was a little shocked to see how exhausted everybody looked. The climb had taken an awful lot out of them. I cautioned them to take the descent slowly and under control, but they were all tired and wanted to get down any way they could and as quickly as possible. Soon they were falling and diving all over the place, and discipline was abandoned. I soon reached the Ifenhütte and stopped where the route passes down a narrow path in the forest. As I came to rest, Lothar Schieferhöfer passed me at tremendous speed, taking a huge dive forwards and crashing into the snow. Fortunately, it was loose powder snow and it broke his fall well. He just stood up and brushed the snow from his clothing. Smiling, he said, 122. I skied down to him and asked him what he had said. 122, he repeated. What are you counting? I asked. He replied that the other skiers had taken a bet to see who would fall over the most times on the downward trip. He had just taken fall number 122. I was relieved to get the whole bunch down without serious injury. Only the next day did the aches and pains of the grueling days begin to show. Kühle was worst, with some pain in the ankles. He didn't ski on the last day, not wanting to aggravate the conditions so near to our return to base. In the evening, we had our farewell celebrations. I don't remember too much about that, only that on the way back we marched, as was our habit, and someone suggested that we shouldn't march in step over the small bridge on the route for fear of breaking it. So we all dutifully fell to our hands and knees and crawled across the bridge. All too soon, the week was over and we returned to the front, happily without any losses. This is a good place to talk about the dogs of war. Many of us had adopted pets and in particular dogs whilst in frontline service. This has over the years been common practice for many soldiers, and I'm sure that it has something to do with the fact that as a soldier you have no real home as you are constantly on the move. It is very uplifting when returning from a mission to have someone or something that is pleased to see you. Many of the pilots had bought pets, but I never really went out to get one. Rather, they seemed to seek me out on their own account. The first dog I had was called Zeddy, a fox terrier. I was still at Böblingen in the officers' quarters, which I shared with Robert Goebel. This consisted of an apartment with 2 bedrooms and a common lounge situated on the ground floor. One night in May I was awakened by a tremendous snoring which I traced as coming from under my bed. There was a small dog, fast asleep, having made itself comfortable. In the morning I handed the dog over to my batman and asked him to find the owner. At lunchtime he reported back to me that it belonged to an Austrian, Oberleutnant Karl. Apparently, the dog had been given back to Karl's batman. Karl himself was away in North Africa. That evening, I again found the dog under my bed, having made its way some distance from Karl's quarters to mine. He'd either got in through the open window or had waited for me to leave the door open for a moment to creep inside and go to sleep again. I didn't mind. I quite liked the little fox terrier, so I let the 2 batmen come to the agreement that the dog would stay with me until Karl returned. After 2 weeks, Karl came back and resumed ownership of Zeddy, but to no avail. The dog still insisted on occupying my flat and just kept turning up. In the end, Karl was so disappointed in the dog's conduct and apparent lack of loyalty that he turned him over to me. That is how I acquired Zeddy. He was a true delight to own and we enjoyed many hours together. We soon became an inseparable team, with Zeddy coming most places with me in my car, to the delight of my parents and my girlfriend. When we took the trip to the pressure chamber at Freiburg for altitude tests, the others had people for company in their fancy cars and I had my loyal friend. He loved to fly with me and frequently took low-altitude flights sitting on the shelf behind my head in the 109. Naturally, I left him at base when we were on active patrol, but on the transit flights to Hangela and Lachen-Speyerdorf, he was right with me. Sometimes it made him airsick and he would end up being sick down my collar, but it didn't matter. If I wasn't around, there were always willing hands to look after this affable little dog, either my batman Hans Steger or one of the NCO pilots. Feldwebel Sigi Voss had a great affection for Zeddy and also took him flying. He would always take the opportunity to look after him if it arose. It was really something to have this loyal little character waiting for you at base when you came back from a flight. It was a sad loss to me when he was run over by an army truck and killed in Laon. When, later on in the war, we had set up our headquarters at Coquel, we, the officers, decided that we would stay in tents rather than take billets in neighboring houses. The tents covered a pit which had been dug into the ground over a meter deep. This was lined with timber slats to prevent the earth from collapsing inwards. Kühle, Hinnergwaller and myself occupied one tent along with some sticks of furniture which had been salvaged from bombed and burned houses in and around Calais. Amongst other things, the French had been required to hand in any shotguns or rifles to the German authorities, and then, in turn, the guns could be released to us. It was only a loan because the German clerks had meticulously documented from whom the guns had come, so that in time they would be returned. We could loan them out from the stores, but we had to sign for them and agree to keep them in good order. We used them for little hunting on the airfield and the surrounding farmland, helping to keep the rabbit and partridge population in order. This had the benefit of giving us some badly needed exercise and also supplementing our diet. In the corner of our tent stood a gun rack with 4 good double-barrel shotguns. One day, on returning to the tent, I found a black and white dog sitting next to it, for all the world as though he was meant to come along on the next hunting trip. He was obviously a mongrel with some spaniel at the front and some collie at the back, finished off with a long and perpetually wagging tail. At first, I tried to chase him off, but he kept coming back. He really meant to stay with me. There was no question about that, because when Kühle and Hinnergwaller appeared later, the dog stayed at my feet, barely acknowledging their presence. Still missing the friendship of Zeddy, we let him stay in the tent overnight, and in the morning a French farmer came from some distance away to claim his dog. He had heard that the dog was with us, and it was no problem to let him have his animal back, although the dog seemed less than happy to go. I didn't think too much more about this until 2 days later. The dog was back, following me everywhere. I think that I was a little irritated by this show of affection. Maybe I didn't want to get too close to another animal the way I'd been to Zeddy. In any event, the farmer turned up again, all but accusing me of stealing his animal, and off went the dog. Again, a couple of days passed and sure enough, my friend came back. This time the farmer came but didn't want his errant hound back anymore and just asked if we'd be willing to pay for it. I agreed and we struck a bargain, and once more I had a 4-footed companion. I asked the farmer what the dog's name was, but what with my heavy accent, the dog didn't seem to want to respond. So I decided upon Terry, and he seemed to like it well enough. Certainly, as soon as he became settled, he proved to be a very disciplined and well-behaved dog, with one notable exception. He loved to hunt and would worry me by sniffing the guns in the rack and then prodding me with his wet nose until I got up and took one of the guns out. I'd never been a hunter before, and it was really due to the ministrations of Terry that I began. At first, I wasn't much of a shot and often only winged partridges and pheasants, and we had to search them out in the grass, which Terry thoroughly enjoyed. Then I'd have to dispatch the wounded birds by wringing their necks. I didn't have the stomach for this, and so the game shooting didn't last long. I just didn't have the soul of a hunter. But when we had been successful, we would enjoy outstanding meals at camp. The squadron cook had been drafted from the Stuttgart Maßgrad Hotel and could normally provide fine meals even given the unimaginative supplies. But give him a brace of game birds and he could work his own special culinary magic. Unfortunately, I just couldn't handle the killing of the birds, and so I stuck to rabbits just to keep Terry happy and provide a variation in our diet. Our hunting trips didn't go off without incident, and I nearly ended up in a duel with an army Hauptmann. Our routine was to hunt in a specific area that was within easy reach of the airfield in case there was a scramble. If it happened, then a flare would be fired up at the airfield, a car would be sent, and I'd hot-footed back and jump straight into my plane. We were out in a beet field when I spotted another hunting party in an adjacent field. If they hadn't been firing the occasional shots, I probably wouldn't have noticed them at all, but as soon as Terry heard the shooting, he was off like a rocket towards the sound of the guns. He charged straight through the beet field, flushing out all the game birds as he went, much to the chagrin of the pioneer Hauptmann and his party. I ran to catch up with Terry and got close enough to see the Hauptmann leveling his gun and firing at my dog, or at least very close to him, and not just once but several times. I could now see that the rest of his party were just soldiers that their officer was using as beaters and that they were unarmed. I started a shouting exchange with the officer, asking him if he couldn't see that his shots weren't scaring the dog. All he was doing was searching. And the more the fellow fired, the more frantically the dog searched for kills. The exchange got quite heated. "My dog is just searching. Can't you see that I'm an officer too?" "You've got a hunting license then, and why are you shooting with such an undisciplined dog? Don't you know that it's cruel to hunt birds without a dog?" It gradually became more and more heated and turned into an exchange of inter-service insults. "Why aren't you up in your plane fighting the British instead of walking around on the ground shooting birds? You Schlipsoldaten are no good anyway. When are you going to clear the way so the real soldiers can get on with the invasion?" We were really getting close to starting to shoot at each other when I noticed that Terry was bleeding from the hind leg and broke away to seek out the farmer to locate a vet. It had all been unwarranted and perhaps a sign of the tensions which existed all around. Terry wasn't badly hurt. He had received a few shot pellets in one leg, but it didn't teach him any lessons. Whenever the armorers were aligning and harmonizing the guns on the 109s, they fired bursts into some straw bales at the edge of the field. Once more, Terry could become a nuisance, running towards the bales at the sound of the first burst and often arriving at the time when the armorers were about to loose off a second hail of bullets. He had several narrow escapes. He was otherwise a most enjoyable dog. One of his most endearing characteristics was running alongside my aircraft as I took off and being there as I landed. Always as I touched down and taxied my 109, I could look down and see Terry running along with me. He always knew which aircraft I was in and never made a mistake, even in the early days when nearly 30 aircraft would be landing. One occasion which I don't think anyone in No. 3 Squadron will forget was the late afternoon of September the 30th, when there had been such a huge losses and we had stopped over in Boulogne to refuel before making the last leg to base. It was almost dark and all around our field were 109s that had been forced to pancake as the last drops of fuel had been used. Our No. 1 and No. 2 squadrons had tried to make it back without refueling, and those that had made it were already in. Amongst our squadron's ground crews there was little hope that we would be back this time. Kühle, who hadn't flown, and the crews all sat around the dispersal point where my aircraft usually stood and where Terry sat on guard. There seemed little doubt as far as the dog was concerned that at least I was on my way back, and they hung onto this as an omen, asking the dog if anyone was coming back. From Boulogne, I telephoned Coquel to let them know that we were on our way back, and the mood of doom was broken with the crews coming out ready to welcome us back. Only Terry remained on guard until his sensitive ears picked up the drone of my DB601 engine many miles out from base. After October the 27th, Terry was taken to my mother's home at Heutingsheim, but later the squadron began to miss the dog and asked if he might not be returned to them. Mother agreed, and Terry went along with them until later in Russia, where any trace of him was lost. With a rather unconventional story about the author's two dogs, we close this episode. Let's get back a bit to the start, where the author learns about the so-called Bürgerbräukeller bombing in November of 1939. Now, many people know about the July 20 plot to kill Hitler conducted by Stauffenberg and his associates, but actually there have been many attempts to kill the Führer throughout his reign. In fact, there have been at least 42 that we know of. This one was conducted by Georg Elser, a woodworker from southern Germany. Elser, a staunch communist, stole some explosives from a stone quarry and used them to set a timed explosive at a beer cellar in Munich. It was intended to explode during a speech of Hitler and blow him up. However, the Führer's speech started and ended uncharacteristically early, and he survived. However, 8 people were killed, among them high-ranking party members but also some civilians. Elser was arrested on the same day while trying to cross the border into Switzerland. He was carrying blasting caps, wire cutters and sketches of the beer cellar on his person, which, as you might imagine, caused considerable suspicion. He was identified as the bomber by witnesses, locked up, beaten and later confessed to the plot. He was sent to the Dachau concentration camp and imprisoned for nearly 5 years. He was executed 1 month before the war ended in 1945. As for our author, the war is closing in on him and he is desperately trying to claim his first kill. We will see if he succeeds in the next episode. Cheers.